Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The power-mad father of the Boleyns, Thomas Boleyn. One of the most prominent families that rose to power during the reign of King Henry VIII was the Boleyn family. Before, they were wealthy landowners. However, when the king's attention was captured by Anne Boleyn, the family became catapulted into power and huge amounts of wealth. Much is known about Anne's relationship with the king, but it's believed by some historians that she was groomed in her upbringing to marry a powerful and wealthy noble or landowner. Fathers at this time planned for their daughters to marry to secure influence for themselves and their family, and Thomas Boleyn, the first Earl of Wiltshire, was no different. He was the father of the Boleyn girls and George Boleyn, and he was a man who was a prominent member of the Tudor court. But he was also the father of the Queen who was brutally executed inside of the Tower of London. But what is his story? Thomas Boleyn was born around 1477 inside of Bickling Hall in Norfolk, the home of the Boleyns. His father was Sir William Boleyn, and his mother was Lady Margaret Butler, who was an heiress to the estate of the 7th Earl of Ormond. But around 1500 he married Lady Elizabeth Howard, who was the eldest daughter of Thomas Howard, the 2nd Duke of Norfolk. The Boleyns and the Howards were linked together through marriage, and both were influential during the reign of Henry VIII and other Tudor monarchs. Together, the couple would have 6 children. The first was Mary Boleyn, who later became the mistress of King Henry VIII. Their second child was Anne Boleyn, who later became the Queen of England. And there was only one other child who survived, George Boleyn, the Viscountess Rochford, who later would also be executed. As a young man, Thomas Boleyn was a respected and prominent part of the royal court of Henry VII, and he was presented at the wedding of Henry VII's eldest son, Prince Arthur Tudor, to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was a wealthy Spanish princess, and a marriage between the king's eldest son and heir was hoped to bring about an alliance between England and Spain. But Arthur died at a young age, and Catherine would then be betrothed to the king's other son, Henry, who later became Henry VIII. Despite this, Catherine of Aragon would become a sworn enemy of the Boleyn family. Thomas Boleyn was also part of the escort of Princess Margaret Tudor in 1503 to Scotland to marry the Scottish king, James IV, and he was then created a Knight of the Bath at the coronation of Henry VIII in 1509. He was then, in 1512, appointed the ambassador to the Low Countries, and he became friendly with Margaret of Austria, and the pair spoke good Latin and French. Their friendship caused Anne Boleyn, Thomas's daughter, to be accepted as one of her maids of honour, but Thomas Boleyn's rise continued. He became one of Henry VIII's leading advisers, and he was appointed the Sheriff of Kent, and also an ambassador to France when he was part of the negotiations for the Field of the Cloth of Gold. He also became an envoy to the Holy Roman Emperor, and later went to try and obtain an annulment for the king and Catherine of Aragon's marriage. He was a trusted ambassador and representative to the king, and he was appointed a Knight of the Garter in 1523. But Thomas was a wealthy man, and when his daughter Anne Boleyn captured the king's eye when she returned from France, it's likely that he never realised the amount of attention and power he would get. He had prepared his daughters for high-profile matches, and Anne, whilst away in Europe, had learned the skilled game of courtly love, and she was considered a temptress. The king was obsessed with Anne, despite the fact he had already had an affair with Thomas's eldest daughter, Mary. Mary was considered very beautiful, and was one of the king's mistresses, but this other Boleyn girl captivated the king. He became obsessed with the idea of sleeping with her, and in 1525 this began, and her father then was elevated to the peerage as Viscount Rochford. The title was prominent, and Thomas is often seen as a power-hungry and ambitious schemer who sacrificed his daughters for his own gain. He was clearly a skilled ambassador, but one of his greatest assets was his daughters. But as the king's attention intensified, Thomas Boleyn was rewarded greatly, and he claimed the earldom of Wiltshire. He tracked his history back, and on the 8th of December 1529 he was created the Earl of Wiltshire and the Earl of Ormond. Following this, his son George was then made Viscount Rochford. However, as sharply as the Boleyn family rose, they received a huge amount of wealth, land and favour from the king, And Anne Boleyn also began to call the shots in important matters too, and she wielded her axe, condemning the lenient treatment of the king's first daughter, Princess Mary. As Anne continued to dominate court life, the Boleyns there were with her constantly, as was Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, her uncle. Howard was seen as one of the king's most trusted men, but in 1530 Thomas Boleyn was appointed the Lord Privy Seal. This was very high up position in the country, and Anne's rise also led to her father's. But with this rise, the downfall would also be incredibly sharp, and would be as ruthless as very few in history. The downfall of the Boleyns came ultimately with Henry VIII's great frustrations in regards to the fact that Anne could not produce him the male heir he so greatly wanted. She had given him a daughter named Elizabeth, who would later go on to be the greatest Tudor monarch as Elizabeth I. With this, Thomas Boleyn was the grandfather of Princess Elizabeth, but Henry VIII wanted a son. Anne had a final miscarriage following the king having a rather severe accident on the tilt yard, and following this he turned on his wife. He asked Thomas Cromwell to come up with a way out of the marriage, as his attention had been turned by Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting of Anne Boleyn. Cromwell created a huge web of lies and deceit that saw Anne Boleyn accused of treason, incest and adultery. She was accused of sleeping with 5 men behind the king's back, and the final nail in the coffin for the Boleyns was one of the men accused of sleeping with her was George Boleyn, her own brother. The two had a very close relationship, and there were accusations that this closeness was more than just 2 brothers and sisters. But this was a lie, and this resulted in the execution of George Boleyn. It was obvious that Anne would be condemned to die, as separately, earlier, 4 men were condemned for sleeping with her. However, George and Anne were tried separately, and were tried at the Tower of London in front of a group of commissioners, including their uncle. George was tried before Anne and was sentenced to death, and Anne was also sentenced to death. George was executed on Tower Hill and was beheaded by an axe on the 17th of May 1536, and a couple of days later, Anne Boleyn was also executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. No one could have predicted what would have happened with the Queen being beheaded by a French swordsman accused of her sleeping with her own brother. Along with his son and daughter, Thomas Boleyn also fell from grace and was replaced as Lord Privy Seal, and he left the royal court in disgrace. He was stripped of his title of Earl of Wiltshire, and he died on the 12th of March 1539 in disgrace at Hever Castle. He is buried inside the church near to the home of the Boleyns, and a brass shows him. He is depicted in full robes wearing the insignia of a Knight of the Garter, and his head rests on a helm with the crest of a falcon displayed. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Here lies Sir Thomas Boleyn, Knight of the Order of the Garter, Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond, which deceased on the 12th day of March in the year of our Lord 1538. Thomas Boleyn was the father of the Boleyn family, who was often shown as being power-hungry and obsessed. He wished for his daughters to achieve greatness, and one was the king's mistress, and the other became Queen of England. He can be viewed as a skilled ambassador, but a man who, through his daughters, gained a huge amount of wealth and influence. Thank you for watching and support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.